So friends, the general points that Professor Bajaj raised in the context of Indian writing in English and seeing its emergence in the 19th century, now we move on to actual texts or trends that reflect that are reflected in the text of the time, let's say the 19th century or the early 20th century, and of course other lectures will cover later developments also. So over to Professor Bajaj again with respect to Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. In continuation to my previous lecture on 19th century thought and women's position in it, we are today looking at, particularly in this lecture, I'll be focusing on Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain, who was born in 1880 and lived till 1932. And the work that we are going to speak about today would be her 1905 work, Sultana's Dream. Now, in the ongoing process of development, women were getting viewed as individuals in their own right? And even as their imprisonment in the home was symbolic of the mother country in chains, they were looking at new ways of expressing themselves. We have spoken about this development in my previous lecture, and women were now thinking of themselves as individuals, right? Which meant that and looking at their imprisonment also in a very mythical, symbolic way as the imprisonment of the mother country, right? So and it becomes interesting when you look at it from that parallel, which means that you first identify that you are in chains, right? So the idea that you are in chains and the country is in chains, that the mother country is in chains, then becomes similar. And the effort to free the mother country that is in chains also translates to free the woman who is in chains. So I think that in a way helped women's movement inadvertently, even as I don't know whether the men really meant it or not, but seeing as the country in the form of a woman who's in chains also gave this kind of women a kind of an idea about their own selves and individuality. They saw themselves in chains and they saw that they were also going through a similar sort of imprisonment at home. And the stream of new consciousness then among women writers emerged at the time. And they were then now beginning to express themselves in these literary magazines that were available. Very interestingly, there was a magazine that was called the Indian Ladies Magazine. Right now, they obviously it was you could say that upper class women were aping Western models. That is certainly there, but they had taken inspiration from the Ladies Magazine, which was published in the UK, and wanted to express themselves, on the page, and which is why they began this Indian Ladies magazine. And this Indian Ladies Magazine was the first English language Indian magazine. Founded and edited by an Indian woman. Yeah, and of course it also included works from these British women at the time. They would include their articles, their take, and it would be a very interesting, healthy give and take intellectual exchange. So it was edited by Kamala Satyanathan, and it foregrounded women's works. So for once you have an Indian Ladies Magazine devoted entirely to women's writing. It gave a space to these women to express themselves, and to writing by Indian women. Of course, it included some British ladies as well, and they would write for.
But the focus was on the
Indian
women.
Was on the Indian experience and Indian women. And this magazine ran several issues from 1901 to 1938, in fact, and became a trendsetter where women's activities in clubs and associations were related about, along with literary critical contributions, and how these women offered their critique of, say, Western literature as well. It was very interesting. So this exposure, in fact, granted women a voice and identity in the early part of the 20th century. So I think this is a very important moment in women's writing, where a journal is devoted to their work, and you could say, and it's about their activities. It also gave a sense of what all associations were being formed by women, what were the the community service activities that they were a part of, or clubs they were a part of. All this also gave them a space to discuss themselves for the first time. And it is in such one of such issues of the magazine that you find, I'm referring to the Indian Ladies Magazine. It is in one of these issues that Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain published her iconic story, Sultana's Dream.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And this story was first published in that magazine in the 1905 issue, and it is a satirical story, and where and a kind of a feminist fantasy, a shared feminist fantasy in women, in which, of course, as we know, that women actually control the state, which means the state functions are then in the hands of women. Now, interestingly, the story actually appended the entire patriarchal structure, and in its space actually built a kind of a dreamland. You could call it a woman's fantasy or a utopian society, where she talks about a ladyland, where women constituted the dominant group in society. They occupied public institutions. They were responsible for the state activities. They are there in the state, doing the state activities, and men were confined, what she calls within this story, the mardana, right? So just as and it's very interesting that these men are now living in seclusion and looking after the house and children. Now, Sultana's Dream was first written in English and then later translated into Bengali. As I said, that the Indian Ladies magazine was an English magazine, right? So later it was translated to Bengali, and we also mentioned that Rokeya was born into a family in Rangpur, which is now in Bangladesh, to a very orthodox mother and very traditional, strict father who did not encourage women's education. Rokeya and her sisters were helped by them, they didn't want their minds to be contaminated by new ideas, so to speak, right? And so they were not allowed to read and write in Bengali or English, and it was Bangla and English were then taught to them by their brothers. And Rokeya was the man she married also helped her, was a progressive liberal man, and he helped her in reading and writing, and in fact encouraged her to publish. She married in 1898, and then the husband was a deputy registrar, and he encouraged Rokeya to write all those things. And 11 years after his death, in fact, 11 years after their marriage, he died, and in his memory she actually opened a school which was called the Sakhawat Memorial Girls School, which was opened in 1911 in Calcutta. And then in 1916 she also founded the Bengali Muslims Women's Association. So you see, what I'm trying to suggest here is that
she's a campaigner.
She's a social reformer. She's as much a social reformer, campaigner, educationist as she is a writer. And she firmly believed in women's education and economic independence for them, and she continued to encourage women to come to these schools. There were these Muslim girls she used to encourage to come to her school, the Sakhawat Memorial Girls School, which she opened particularly only for girls, right? And having these associations, so even when she lost her husband, she continued to work as a kind of social person, and as a literature, of course, she courageously wrote about women's emancipation and participated in these intellectual debates of the time, writing stories, poems, essays. So Sultana's Dream is not the only thing she wrote. In fact, she has, to her credit, two collection of essays which is called Mati Chur, and it is a 2-volume work. The first one was published in 1904 and the other volume was 1924. So there is a 2-volume collection that she has of essays that she has written about women, about her life, etc. She's also written a novella which is titled Padmarag, published in 1924, along with several short stories, and charting women's journey towards enlightenment and freedom. So this is a part of a larger collective work that she has done, Sultana's Dream, and not just a one-off thing that this woman has written, is something that I thought also needs underscoring here, that she's written collection of essays, she's written a novella, she's written stories, poems, and she has written Sultana's Dream that we often focus on. Now, Sultana's Dream is very interesting. Let's return to that. Sara is an inhabitant of Ladyland, right? And basically what happens is that the protagonist here slips into a dream, and she's sitting in an easy chair, and sitting in an easy chair, and she slips into a dream. Now, when she slips into the dream, lounging in an easy chair, she's thinking about the conditions of Indian women. It's reminded me of Kubla Khan, like sitting in the chair thinking about something, and then you're transported in dream to that place. So similarly, you have the protagonist lounging in an easy chair thinking about the condition of women in society, and this is what leads to her dream. And in the dream, she's immediately transported to a place where there is not even a single man who's visible. She's made fun of by passers-by who thinks she looks very mannish. Yeah. Now think of the terminology, what she has done. Of course, the reference reminds us how being womanish is always considered to be an abuse in a patriarchal society. So when she enters this new world where there is not a single man to be seen on street and there are hundreds of women walking, you know, this is the scene that you see in any patriarchal society. There'd be hundreds of men walking and, you know, just a couple of handful of women around, right? And so she says, I have entered a world where there are hundreds of women and no man to be seen anywhere. And she said, it puzzled me, where have the man gone? And then Sister Sarah tells her that all the men are there in their proper place. And she says, what is that proper place? She says, that is the zinanas. We have locked them in. Mardana. You know, and we call them the Mardana now, right? So the idea of how, you know, what I found interesting, what was shocking was that when you invert the logic and turn the entire logic on men, it just suddenly becomes shocking. It shocks you how women have been locked inside. She says that we have put them in there, we have put men in their proper place now. We've put them in and we've put them in the house and in the kitchen and we've locked them in, and that place now we call Mardana. So suddenly when the logic is turned on men, it shocks the reader and it also shocks the protagonist. And when she says that, you know, the people around her are looking at her and calling her mannish. She said, what do you mean by mannish? How am I, I'm a woman, how am I looking mannish? She said, because mannish refers to being shy and weak and timid. So because you are looking, so I think it's how anybody who is weak or appears to be weak and timid and shy is saying, you know, oh, you are behaving like a woman. You know, what guy, you are a woman or are you a girl? Right? We often use this as a kind of an abuse. So she says that you are looking mannish, which means you are looking timid, shy and weak. So, you know, how inversion takes place. What do you think about it? The protagonist is shocked and because she says, you know, I am a Parda Nashin woman. Please, I am feeling very uncomfortable and awkward in your land. And then Sister Sarah reminds her that this is lady land, which means ladies rule here and which is free from sin and harm, and virtue herself reigns here. So in a way, that's how, you know, the narrative takes us forward into the...
No, see the humor. This society is divided along class lines.
Right.
And the class is the male and the female. And now if the whole thing is inverted, then things should shock. Actually they should not be shocking, right. Because another kind of, you know, division was there, have existed over the centuries.
Right.
So if you look at the whole thing from a different angle, and this is what you referred to, I think, as the scientific temper. You can invert things and you can bring a kind of logic to give an impression that this is an old world coming in a new form. So when the new form comes, then it becomes shocking. So I think she is using this technique very well in order to wake up in order to awaken the audience about the distortions that occur in society. So I think it's really very literary, it's very fascinating, it's very provocative.
Very provocative. Yes. Also, I mean, it just suddenly strikes home the point, you know, that this is what you've been doing to women. You've been calling some person womanish or girlish because you think this person is timid or weak. And the moment now you change the term and you start calling them mannish or boyish, you're being very boyish, which means that you're being very weak and you are very shy. So you've turned the logic of patriarchy on its head, you know, and that's what she's using. The whole dynamic she's using is of whatever women are told, you know, that keep women in their proper place. And she says now we keep men in their proper place. And what is that proper place? Inside the house, in the Mardana, which is where women were put in the zinana.
And literally, you know, revolution means that those who are up, they are down, and those who are down are up.
Yeah.
So that's revolution.
Case. Yes, absolutely. I mean, we call it a fantasy, and it is of course utopia because she builds in very interesting imaginative sweeps she takes, but actually it brings home, it's a very sharp critique of patriarchy in that sense. In fact, Sarah, who's an inhabitant of the Ladyland and who Sultana joins, right, and Sarah takes her on this trip of Ladyland, you know, she says that she in fact she scolds Sultana for bearing injustices in the story. She says, you have done this to yourself. And you know, when she says, when Sultana says that, you know, we are not safe outside the house, and for our own safety we are kept inside the house, right? She's using the patriarchal logic that, you know, Zanana is a place where we are safe because it's not safe for us to be outside on the street. And then Sara says that, if some mad men, if some mad people leave the asylum and roam the city and create havoc, what are you going to do? She said, of course, we are going to put them back in the asylum. She said, then why are you innocent people put inside the Zanana and the mad lunatics left on the street? She said, lock up the lunatics and those who deserve to be in the asylum, and the innocent ones should be able to walk free. Again, Sultana says, you know, that we can't fight men because we are weak. You know, and we are naturally weak, she says. Then Sara says here, a lion is stronger than a man, but it does not enable him to dominate the human race. So
lion is kept in a cage.
So she says that, what makes you think that because men are stronger, so you can't overpower them? Man has been able to overpower a lion. So what Sara continuously is telling Sultana here is that you have neglected the duty you owe to yourself, and that you have lost your natural rights by shutting your eyes, to your own interests. And, you know, these are the fiery speeches, I think, that may pave the way for what may be called an Indian feminism. Yeah, and there is a complete role reversal that this story shows, you know, that Rokeya is projecting here, and became obviously the center of controversy, etc. In fact, Rokeya's husband said that you've taken within quotes, a terrible revenge on the male fraternity. He laughed, he had a good time reading the story and he enjoyed it, and he said that, you know, that you have taken a terrible revenge on the male fraternity through this story. But what is important is that these imaginative flights that, for instance, Rokeya took in Sultana's dreams, these were the first rays of hope that women's movement in India, took shape from and took inspiration from. And, you know, Rokeya's story is in many ways a precursor to what we may call Indian feminism in the 20th century that would actually redefine women's role in society. So I think from this point of view, I find this a very interesting story to dwell on and to understand how patriarchy blinds you, but at the same time it also creates a kind of a narrative that to subjugate the subject to the women in society. You know, the whole logic of for instance, when she's using the asylum metaphor also here, Sara says that, you know, if a lion is if a predator, if an animal who's out on rampage, if you find this person, if you find this outside, what will you do? You are going to cage this person, right? And not cage the innocent people, but you have caged the entire innocent section of society, right, that is the women, and left all predators out on the street and saying that we are not safe outside. So we are not safe outside because there is a predator who's doing the rounds on the street. Lock up the predator and not the innocent women. So, you know, the kind of logic she puts forth actually goes home and creates a sort of a dent in thinking, I'd say an alternate view of society. In fact, it's very interesting that Rokeya's Ladyland of Sultana's Dream came out in 1905. It actually precedes the American feminist writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman's book Her Land, which came out in 1915.
10 years later.
Now, both these texts, to be honest, talk about a feminist utopia. I mean, as you can see, Her Land suggests it is all women out there. And just as there were Ladyland, who were doing the taking up the entire responsibility of society. So in Her Land, of course, Gilman goes further and she just builds an entire society comprising of women. You know, they are also able to take up reproduction, etc. So men are not there. But in Rokeya's Ladyland, you have men who have been relegated to women's role, and then women have begun to do the men's part. So it's not just a feminist story. There are two interesting angles there. One about scientific advancements, because she's talking in the story about solar energy being harnessed, about using the brain. She says that when in the story they are attacked by another neighboring country, the queen says that we don't have that kind of manpower. Fine, use your brain to counter the enemy. And so it's a utopia. So they use the solar energy that they have preserved, and they unleash it on the enemy and they are all burnt and all of that happens. But the idea is very important, that scientific knowledge, advancement in scientific knowledge, technological advancement, she's already talking about air cars and people, that there is no pollution, for instance, and that there are no accidents on the road, suggesting again that women are better keepers, are preservers of a culture. But at the same time, so it's not to say that men are cooking or men are taking care of gardens. She says in the story that we find it a very important thing, we don't let men do anything because they can't seem to do anything right. So she's anyway reversing again the logic, that women can't do anything right, sort of a thing. So it's not like she's shifted the responsibility that women had on men, but that horticulture, gardening, all those things, embroidering. And she says, so if you've reversed so Sultana says, if you've reversed the roles, have you also given them work to do embroidery? She says, no, we don't trust them with anything because they are incapable of taking up anything. We do all of it ourselves. And there is a kind of a work culture that she mentions. She says that, and Sultana says, how do you have so much time to work at home and to work in the office, to manage the government, to work in laboratories? How do you have time? She says, I work only 2 hours a day, right? And she says, are you able to complete the work? She said, yes. So in a way, what I thought was that as we progress technologically, our working hours should reduce. On the contrary, in our own system, if you notice, our working hours have increased, right? So in a way, she's also building a very healthy, in her fantasy, in her utopia, she's building a healthy, sustainable life, or sustainable way of living.
Which means it has been worked out well intellectually.
Intellectually. So she says that we don't have to work 7 hours a week. 7 hours a day. So Sultana says that, but in our India, we have to work 7-8 hours a day, every day. Then that's how work gets done. She said, no, that's not required. 2 hours a day, though, if you do the work, then it is fine. And then she says, well, men smoke 6 hours. So you think that they are working for 8 hours. They are not. They are only doing 2 hours work and 6 hours. They are just roaming around and idling away. She said there are no fights because we don't have the time to fight. We are always engaged in some activity, whether it is creative or it is functional or state oriented. So I think it's a larger vision, and it is not just a feminist sort of a utopia, but in general, I think it is the ideal society that she's building, where nobody has to work for, say, 8 hours, 12 hours, and technology is doing. She says, who tills your field? She said, oh, we have electricity and we are using locomotive powers to, and machines to work on the field. So when technological growth has taken you in that direction, then the machine is doing the job and you have more free time, not free time, but you have more time to pursue your creative urgings and desires. So in a way, I thought that when she mentioned about the number of hours here, it was building a future, imagining a future where pressure on human beings would lessen, and work and every aspect of life would become a pleasure and not necessarily a burden as we see today. How do you respond to this?
No, actually, I'm thinking of the aspect of English being the medium of this kind of writing. And I believe that the writing will go not just to the Indian educated middle class, but it will also go outside. And the colonial powers and other societies will also look at it from a different angle. And I believe there is a kind of internationalism here than nationalism. So it's a story. It's a story about the future, where the world will emerge, divided along lines of gender, and finally, because it's critically presented, therefore, gender equality will lead to social equality. So that kind of a thing occurred to me, and I don't know whether that will fit in with the Indian writing in English context or not.
No, I think I would like to be more controversial here and suggest that she's suggesting here that women are better able to manage the state and the affairs of society,
Which is true,
than men, right? So this is her basic idea, that men can't be trusted with such an important thing as running an entire society, and they've created a mess of it, and it's time that and she says it in the story, that they've really made a mess of society, and it is time that women, and which is why we don't trust them with anything, and we just put them inside the house and we tell them that you just stay there, everything else will be taken over by women. So I think that it's a very interesting sort of a imaginative sweep, but at the same time an important point that needs consideration, that that women at the time visualized that more and more women should enter the state and should enter the space where policy decisions are being taken.
Did this percolate to other English writers in India, the Indians? Because it might have. After all, it started from 1905, and there is English writing in India at that point of time is not very developed, very evolved. So I think it starts from a height, and finally I think the river it divides into smaller streams and dries up.
No, I think it is often dismissed as a kind of a feminist utopia. And the moment you call something a utopia, it seems to be unattainable, sort of a thing. Idealized, wished for, and yet unattainable. But I refuse to see it as a kind of a utopia. I think it's a feminist dream, which can turn, and it is Sultana's dream.
Very realistic.
Yes, it's not called Sultana's utopia. It's called Sultana's dream. So it is a woman's dream.
So dream is a part of reality.
Yeah, dream is the seed of reality. So I think that therefore I find this to be a very important and it is Rokeya who was able to build this kind of a thing. I think a lot of other kind of narratives would become more social. For instance, in one case, it's a very happy blend of the imaginative and the real. So there is a very good literary quality, because it doesn't just talk about women, but about an ideal society that is worth living in and enjoying at the same time. So I think this is what makes me I'm always attracted to this kind of work. Like Gilman's Herland, for instance, would completely take men out of the picture, and she said we don't need these kind of men. Again, that's a kind of a feminist utopia or dream, whatever. But I find Rokeya's interpretation realistic, in the sense that what if in society women took over all these spheres? What if in parliament you had all 80%, 90% women folk there? What if this country was governed by a woman? And would things change then? So this is, and would only an individual changing make the difference, or is it a larger vision that we are speaking of? So I think those questions 100 years down the line are still relevant. It's a tragedy in many ways that Sultana's dream is not even partially realized, but I think in many ways it makes us think more.
What I like in the story is the clash of different perspectives, and one perspective is chosen for its internal merit than any kind of prejudice.
Yes, there's also a very wry humor. She uses humor and satire for this.
And now there is a stream of writing of this kind. Science fiction is one thing. Then 1984, those books, they also take Brave New World. They are taken from here, and it's affecting. This kind of a writing is now going in different directions, not just in India but even outside. And dream, becomes a kind of expression of something which can be realized later. So realizability and impossibility, those things, those lines are blurred now. And you can always think, and Shakespeare way back would say thought is free, and she is saying, oh, okay, thought is free, let's look at it this way also.
Yeah, and also the absurdity of the argument then becomes more pronounced, what men expect women to do.
Yes.
So I think when she puts it on men, then the absurdity of the logic also goes home to them. So I think that was her purpose also in writing this.
So, how would you sum it up
I think a
text?
revolutionary new thought is emerging in 19th century in India, courtesy all these women and very importantly the social reformers of the time who helped and encouraged women to express themselves freely. And I think this is going to give us the kind of proper paradigm in which Indian feminism can be understood or even analyzed. So I would like to see her as the mother of Indian feminism in that sense, Rokeya Begum, among several other women who I've mentioned earlier.
Coming through English?
Coming through English and the vernacular, both.
Vernacular also.
Right.
And there is a kind
because
of...
she also wrote in Bengali. It's not like she was writing only in English. So yeah, I think that's how I would like to conclude that this is an important moment in Indian women's history and in Indian women's literature. Particularly the 19th century becomes the foundation on which other literatures would build their own narratives and find feet, so to speak.
And since you have brought in the Bengali reference, so there are two giants of Bengali literature, Tagore and Sharat Chandra, and both of them tilt towards women as the source of power and strength.
Yes.
And this may have to do something with that also.
Right. I think 19th century gave a lot of emphasis to women in that sense through different, I mean all these writers at the time who were progressive, even Fakir Mohan Senapati for instance, all these writers spoke about women's rights, women's education. So I think women came to the center in the 19th century importantly in narrative, myth, ideology, etc. All of that.
And the movement in education in North India, in South India, in Bengal, and women's education became a really an important factor there, and that created a whole climate of opinion in favor of women. Let's say in the 1970s and 80s later, much later.
But you know the women's became the focus in the 19th century, and that led to the image of the Mother India also. You know, in chains that I spoke about earlier. So, you know, you could connect the Indian, the country, the map of the country as a woman. And then, so I think, therefore, I think there's a lot of emphasis on women in the 19th century.
And the metaphor gets translated and or transformed in different other languages also. In Hindi, there is a book, there is a phrase called Bharat Mata Gram Vasini. So, the writer says that it's not just the city woman. The Bharat Mata actually remains there in the villages. So, Bharat Mata concept, I think emerged rightly in a popular form in the 19th century.
19th century, yes.
So, friends, lots of questions have been raised, and I don't think all questions have to be resolved. You have to carry forward the spirit of discussion and analysis and exploration, and for that, this kind of a discussion is going to be extremely useful. Thank you.